Everyone, it's William with the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series. I just aborted one and started a new one because I said that it was currently 1924, and then I said no, 2024, and now I remember, okay, it's 2025. But this is the 1921 diary series, the much anticipated, I hope, showdown between Dmitri and Ducky, Grand Duchess Victoria Fyodorovna, wife of Kirill. And let's have a recap. So this is part 2 of the diary entry of 10th of March, which was a Thursday. And so this is not a recap of what happened the day before, but of what happened earlier that day. So it started out with Dmitri and Maria and Gulia and the Polovtsovs and Shagubatov all going off and having lunch at a fancy restaurant, La Rue, to celebrate the Russian holiday, excuse me, of Mustin. It's a cheese fair, Sunday or cheese fair week, as we call it. And while they were there, Dmitri was told that he had a phone call from Ducky. And it turned out that she wanted him to come and see her immediately. And he couldn't do that because he had a prior engagement, but he did agree to go and see her after he went to see this other person who was the Duchess d'Ursay, a woman in her 70s, kind of a force to be reckoned with in France, of broad connection, and she agreed. He went to her at the advice of Pete Polovtsov in the hope of doing some damage control, that she could spread the word among the French governmental elite that Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich of Russia was not pro-German, and indeed he wasn't. But that impression had been left over by his trip to Germany. So she agreed to do that, and then when he was finished with that, his next engagement was with Ducky. So for this diary entry, we have no new people. All the people mentioned are people that you have encountered before in the diaries. All right, so I'll try to make it through this. So he says that he left the home of the Duchess d'Ursay, and here we go. From her place, I went to the Hotel Loti to meet with Ducky, which turned out to be very interesting. At first, she was so upset that she could hardly talk. Naturally, Ducky started accusing me of working against Kirill. She said that if it turns out that Misha was killed, then don't you understand that you go against your emperor and you're a traitor and will have to be shot? There, I pointed out that I was not working against Kirill, that I wasn't aligned with any party, and that certain people, of whom there are a great many, finding Kirill's behavior on 17th March to be reprehensible, have naturally turned to me and not to him. Overall, as one would expect, the conversation went absolutely nowhere. In the end, Ducky just insisted that for the sake of appearances, we should pretend that we're on good terms, whereas in private we can say whatever we want to each other. Then she said that she wanted to have lunch with me at the Ritz the next day so that we could be seen together. Naturally, I agreed. From Ducky's, I went to see Coco at the Ritz. I dined at Maria's that evening. The Polovtsovs were there, so Maria and I couldn't talk about anything. All right, there we go. Pretty straightforward. You know, it doesn't require a lot of commentary or really any to unravel, and yet there are things that I do want to say about what I find the most interesting. But before getting into that, just to start, the Hotel Loti, it's spelled L-O-T-T-I. It still exists. You can find it online. The decor is very, very nice. I find it quite appealing, more so than the other hotels I've looked up in relation to Dmitri. It was called, I guess, the smallest of grand hotels because it did have a grand clientele, and yet it was quite cozy. Okay, and if you're in Paris, you want to go have a look, walk around. It's at 7 Rue de Castiglione, And I don't know if this was a place where Ducky or Kirill or any of their family typically stayed in Paris, but yeah, if you're there, it'd probably be fun to have a look at it. Okay, so what is interesting about this showdown in particular? Well, I find it interesting that Ducky is fighting Kirill's battles. You know, interesting but not really surprising. Kirill, as far as I know, suffered fairly severely from PTSD, going back to his experience in the Russo-Japanese War, when the ship he was on had sunk. And I think he was one of 2 or 3 people only who survived. And yes, that would have been a very, very intense experience. You know, he seems to have been quite a retiring person, maybe even a shy person. And I wonder if he would have had this ambition to be the emperor in exile if it hadn't been for Ducky. And, you know, there are quite possibly some of you watching this who know a lot more about him than I do. He wrote memoirs, and I read his memoirs, My Life in Russia's Service. I thought it, to be honest, kind of a ridiculous title. I was never that impressed by by Grand Duke Vladimir himself, or by his children in that branch of the family. And I think Vladimir's wife, like her daughter-in-law, had been a very ambitious person. Vladimir, as far as I can see, was just kind of a silly man. And this was not what you would call the intellectual branch of the family. I don't know if Kirill was an intelligent person or not. You know, he's always, his wife is always in the forefront, so it's hard to say. So anyway, I find that interesting. It's interesting that Ducky refers to your emperor. At first, I thought she was talking about Nicholas II. And it is a little equivocal, isn't it? And another thing that's interesting is that Dmitri writes this in English. He quotes her, I don't know if it's a word-for-word quote, but he presents it as a quote of her saying, "Don't you understand that you go against your emperor?" He puts that in English, and so that leads me to believe that they were probably speaking in English. Ducky was not a native speaker of Russian, and she'd come to Russia relatively late in her life. So they were probably speaking English, and when she says, "Don't you understand that you go against your emperor," is she talking about Nicholas II? I don't think so. I think she's talking about Kirill. I think she already views him quite definitely as the emperor. Interesting, this reference to Misha. If it turns out that Misha has been killed, I should have said has been instead of was, then that means, Dmitri, that you are going against your emperor. Yeah, it has to be Kirill, which makes you a traitor. And what happens to traitors? Well, traitors are typically shot. And there's a little bit of an equivocal meaning here. She uses the word, well, she probably didn't, but Dmitri reverts to Russian, and he uses the word должен. And должен can be, you should be shot, or должен could be, you must be shot. And she puts in the future tense. So it kind of sounds more, I've always translated this passage as you should be shot, but I'm thinking maybe now I'm leaning a little more toward you will have to be shot. So, you know, when Kirill mounts the throne, you better stay far away from Russia, old boy, or else you are going to be executed. Well, that is a very emotional outburst, isn't it? Boy, she is in a state. She can hardly talk, Dmitri has told us. And when she does talk, what a nasty thing to say. On the other hand, Dmitri, who, as we've talked in the past, seems to have had a hard time saying no, and sometimes a hard time standing up for himself. Well, just watch out if you get him angry. So now he's giving her a real piece of his mind. He's telling her just how he sees her husband and how other people, of whom there are a great many, he says, see her husband. Her husband's reprehensible behavior on 17th March, well, what was that? That was his famous march to the Duma, wearing a red ribbon or something to signify that he was on the side of the revolution. So yeah, that shocked people. I'm not surprised. Personally, I don't consider that to have been the biggest drawback in Kirill's claim to be the throne, to be the guardian of the throne and then to be the emperor. He was the product of a first cousin marriage, so gross, and he was also married to a divorcee. And so those, to me, were things that were even less in his favor, that I could readily forgive the march on the Duma. Dmitri, too, supported the provisional government, so let's not be hypocritical here, although he didn't do it so overtly, to be sure. He had more sense than that. But at any rate, he says this to Ducky, and he concludes by saying that it's natural, that of course they've turned to me and not to your reprehensible husband who did this horrible thing. Well, if Ducky brings up the subject of Rasputin, then Dmitri doesn't tell us. So it would be interesting to know if she sort of gave tit for tat with that one. Anyway, so now she suggests that even though they don't like each other, even though that they're hostile to each other, they need to be seen together so that there won't be the appearance of division within the imperial family. Well, I think, I think that ship had sailed, but, maybe it wasn't a bad idea. I think Dmitri, insofar as he did want to see things unified, I'm not surprised that he went along with it, although he's really letting and will continue to let Ducky dictate the times and places to him, and when he's going to do it, where, all this sort of thing. He's gonna let her bully him a little bit. So anyway, that's that. Naturally, I agreed, he says. And then he goes to seek a little solace with Coco, whom he hasn't seen since he's gotten back to Paris. And we don't know if she was at home or not. She was living at the Ritz at that time, and he just says he went to see her. But if she was at home, he didn't spend much time with her because he had dinner at Maria's that evening. He and Coco did not go out. And, he wanted to talk to his sister about this. It was probably upsetting, and he wanted to see what she thought about it. But they couldn't, because the Polovtsovs were there. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. He seems to have been the one, at this point, who was more or less pursuing Coco. So we'll hear more about that. And in fact, what we have, so we're up to the 10th. The short entries are going to go through the 15th, at which time he'll dive into another one of the long entries where he talks more about his feelings and opinions about things, and we'll possibly get more detail about this, hopefully. But this is the beginning of a tough time for him. Not just the whole thing with Ducky. I mean, that was bad enough, but there will be other repercussions. And so he's beginning to go into this, it could have been a serious depression. And so he's writing these very short diary entries. So for the next video, we can do both the 11th and 12th for sure. None of them are very long. They are interesting because this is the beginning of the serious part of his relationship with Coco, who clearly perceives how distressed he is over all of this. And our old friend Audrey Parr is going to reappear. Interesting. And, you know, I wonder if Dmitri felt a little guilty in relation to Kirill. I mean, he would be the kind of person who would listen to what Ducky said. When Ducky said, "Oh, you're a traitor," made him angry, but he was the kind of person whom, you know, something like that would nag at him a bit. Even if he didn't believe it, it would nag at him a bit. But anyway, that's as may be. We'll find out more about his depression and how he deals with it and how Coco helps him deal with it. So come back next time, and I'll see you then.